What if I told you that toxic people don't attack randomly? They test you first. Every insult, every passive-aggressive comment, every disrespectful moment is actually a psychological experiment to see one thing: how much control they can get over you. And here's the truth most people never realize. The moment you understand why toxic people test you, you gain a simple mental strategy that makes their manipulation collapse instantly. Think about the last time someone pushed your buttons. Maybe they criticized you for no reason. Maybe they made a sarcastic comment in front of others. Maybe they ignored your boundaries and acted like it was nothing. Toxic people rarely begin a relationship or interaction with open hostility. Instead, they quietly test boundaries to understand how much influence they can gain over someone. These tests are often subtle and disguised as jokes, criticism, or small acts of disrespect. At first glance, they may seem harmless, but psychologically, they serve a very specific purpose. The toxic person is observing reactions. They want to know how much behavior the other person will tolerate and how easily they can push emotional buttons. Every response becomes information they can use later. These tests often start small because extreme behavior too early would immediately expose their intentions. A sarcastic comment might be the first signal. If the other person laughs it off even though it feels uncomfortable, the toxic individual interprets that as permission. Next time, the joke might become sharper or more insulting. The process continues step by step, gradually increasing the level of disrespect. It is similar to someone slowly turning a dial, watching carefully to see when resistance appears. Another common boundary test involves interrupting or dismissing someone's opinions. A toxic person might cut someone off during a conversation or ignore what they said entirely. If the person stays quiet and accepts the interruption, the toxic individual learns that their voice can dominate the conversation. Over time, this can evolve into a pattern where one person constantly controls discussions while the other becomes increasingly passive. Emotional manipulation is also a form of boundary testing. A toxic individual may blame someone unfairly or create unnecessary guilt. If the person immediately apologizes, even when they did nothing wrong, the manipulator realizes that guilt is an effective tool. Later, they may use the same tactic repeatedly because it produces the reaction they want. In their mind, the behavior worked, so it becomes part of their strategy. These tests are rarely conscious calculations, but they are deeply rooted in behavioral psychology. Humans naturally repeat actions that give them power or advantage. For toxic personalities, control over other people becomes a source of validation and security. By pushing boundaries and watching responses, they slowly map out the limits of someone's tolerance. The most important part of this dynamic is that boundaries are not discovered through words alone, but through reactions. Someone may say they value respect, yet if they tolerate repeated disrespect, their behavior communicates a different message. Toxic individuals pay far more attention to these reactions than to what someone claims to believe. Each moment of silence, hesitation, or emotional reaction becomes data that helps them understand how far they can push the relationship without facing resistance. Testing people is not only about curiosity for toxic personalities, it is also a psychological power move. When someone repeatedly pushes boundaries, makes subtle insults, or creates uncomfortable situations, they are often trying to establish a hierarchy within the relationship. In simple terms, they want to determine who holds more control. This behavior reflects a deeper psychological need for dominance, validation, and influence over others. In many interactions, human beings naturally seek a sense of position or status. Healthy individuals do this through cooperation, respect, and competence. Toxic individuals, however, often attempt to achieve that position through manipulation and psychological pressure. By testing someone's reactions, they try to determine whether the other person will challenge them or submit to their behavior. Each interaction becomes a silent negotiation of power. For example, a toxic person might openly question someone's decisions in front of others. On the surface, it may appear like simple disagreement, but the real intention is to challenge authority or confidence. If the person being questioned becomes defensive, embarrassed, or unsure, the toxic individual perceives this as a sign of weakness. That reaction signals that their tactic successfully shifted the balance of power. Once they sense this shift, they may continue using similar behavior in future situations. Another common power move involves emotional provocation. Toxic individuals often say things that trigger anger, frustration, or guilt. The purpose is not just to upset someone, but to observe how they respond under pressure. Emotional reactions reveal vulnerabilities. When someone reacts strongly, they unknowingly show which topics, insecurities, or triggers affect them the most. A manipulative person can later use that information to control conversations or situations. Control over attention is another subtle aspect of this power dynamic. Toxic individuals may interrupt conversations, dominate discussions, or dismiss other people's contributions. When others allow this behavior to continue, it reinforces the toxic person's belief that they hold authority within the interaction. Over time, this can shape the entire relationship, turning one person into the decision maker while the other becomes hesitant or submissive. This process often happens gradually. The toxic person continuously evaluates how much influence they have gained. If someone challenges them calmly and confidently, the power move fails. But if the person hesitates, apologizes unnecessarily, or reacts emotionally, the toxic individual interprets that as confirmation that their strategy is working. Each successful test strengthens their sense of control and encourages them to repeat the behavior in more direct or aggressive ways. As the relationship continues to develop and the psychological advantage slowly becomes more visible within everyday interactions, toxic people often provoke emotional reactions because emotions are one of the easiest ways to influence and control someone's behavior. When a person becomes angry, defensive, guilty, or confused, their ability to think clearly weakens. Logical thinking slows down, and emotional impulses take over. Toxic individuals understand this dynamic, sometimes consciously and sometimes instinctively, and they use it as a tool to gain psychological advantage in conversations and relationships. One of the most common ways they do this is through subtle criticism. Instead of openly attacking someone, they might make a comment that sounds like advice but carries hidden judgment. For example, they might say something like, "I'm just surprised you handled it that way," or "Most people would have done that differently." Statements like these are designed to trigger self-doubt. If the person immediately begins defending themselves or explaining their choices, the toxic individual learns that they have successfully created insecurity and emotional discomfort. Another tactic involves sarcasm or passive-aggressive remarks. These comments are often delivered in a joking tone, so the toxic person can deny any harmful intention if confronted. If the target becomes upset, the toxic individual might respond by saying they were just joking. This creates confusion and shifts blame onto the other person for being too sensitive. The emotional reaction becomes the focus instead of the original disrespectful comment. Anger is another reaction that toxic people frequently try to provoke. When someone becomes angry, their responses can become impulsive and less controlled. A manipulative person may deliberately say something insulting or unfair simply to spark a heated reaction. Once the other person loses their composure, the toxic individual can portray them as unreasonable or unstable, which shifts the social perception of the situation in their favor. Guilt is another powerful emotional trigger. Toxic personalities often exaggerate small mistakes or twist situations so that someone feels responsible for problems they did not create. When the target starts apologizing excessively or trying to fix things that were never truly their fault, the manipulator realizes they can easily influence that person's behavior through guilt. The key reason these emotional reactions are valuable to toxic individuals is that emotions reveal vulnerabilities. Every strong reaction provides information about what matters to someone, what hurts them, and what pressures them. Over time, the manipulative person gathers these emotional signals and learns exactly which words, topics, or situations will create the strongest reaction, allowing them to guide conversations and conflicts in ways that maintain their influence and keep the other person emotionally off balance during future interactions. Silence and composure can be one of the most powerful responses when dealing with toxic behavior because they interrupt the emotional dynamic that manipulators rely on. Toxic individuals often expect strong emotional reactions such as anger, frustration, or defensiveness. These reactions give them the attention and psychological leverage they are seeking. When someone refuses to respond emotionally and instead remains calm and composed, the toxic person suddenly loses the predictable response they were expecting. Emotional reactions create energy in a conversation. When someone becomes angry or defensive, the situation becomes intense and reactive. Toxic personalities often feed off this intensity because it allows them to shift the conversation away from their behavior and toward the emotional reaction of the other person. For example, if someone responds to a rude comment with visible anger, the toxic person may quickly focus on that anger rather than the original disrespect. They might accuse the other person of overreacting or being too sensitive, turning themselves into the victim while the other person appears aggressive or unstable. Remaining calm removes this opportunity. When a person responds to a provocation with composure, the toxic individual cannot easily redirect the conversation. There is no emotional outburst to criticize, no visible frustration to exploit. Instead, the toxic behavior becomes more obvious to everyone involved because it is not hidden behind an emotional reaction. Calm responses expose manipulation more clearly than arguments ever could. Silence can also be a powerful psychological signal. When someone refuses to immediately react to a manipulative comment, it creates a moment of uncertainty. The toxic person expects a predictable response, but silence disrupts that expectation. This uncertainty can make them uncomfortable because their strategy depends on controlling the emotional rhythm of the interaction. Without that control, they are forced to reconsider their approach. Composure also communicates confidence. People who remain calm under pressure appear emotionally stable and self-assured. Toxic individuals often search for signs of insecurity or emotional vulnerability because those traits are easier to manipulate. When someone maintains a steady tone, relaxed posture, and thoughtful responses, it sends a subtle message that emotional manipulation will not be effective. Over time, this pattern changes the entire dynamic of the relationship. When toxic individuals repeatedly fail to provoke emotional reactions, their attempts lose effectiveness. The manipulative behavior stops producing the results they expect, and the psychological reward disappears. Without that reward, many toxic individuals either reduce their behavior or shift their attention toward people who respond more emotionally and provide the reactions they are seeking to control within social interactions. Clear boundaries are one of the strongest defenses a person can have when dealing with toxic individuals because boundaries define what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not. Toxic people often rely on blurred limits and hesitation from others. When someone does not clearly communicate their limits, it creates space for manipulation, disrespect, and emotional control. Boundaries remove that space by making expectations visible and firm. In many situations, toxic individuals begin by testing how much they can get away with. They may interrupt conversations, make sarcastic remarks, or push responsibilities onto others. If these actions go unchallenged, they interpret the silence as permission. The absence of boundaries tells them that their behavior will not face resistance. Over time, this encourages them to push further because each small success reinforces the idea that they can continue without consequences. A clear boundary changes this pattern immediately. When someone calmly states that certain behavior is not acceptable, the dynamic shifts. The toxic person is no longer operating in uncertainty. They now understand that there is a limit they cannot cross without being confronted. This clarity often disrupts manipulative strategies because manipulation depends on confusion, hesitation, and emotional pressure. Boundaries replace confusion with certainty. The way boundaries are communicated is also important. Effective boundaries are calm, direct, and consistent. They do not rely on anger or aggression. Instead, they simply describe the limit and the expectation moving forward. For example, someone might say that they do not appreciate being interrupted and expect to finish speaking before the conversation continues. Delivered calmly, this statement signals self-respect without escalating the conflict. Consistency strengthens boundaries over time. If a person sets a boundary once but allows it to be ignored later, the message becomes weak. Toxic individuals often watch for these inconsistencies because they reveal opportunities to regain control. When the boundary is enforced consistently, however, the toxic person learns that the limit is real and cannot be bypassed through pressure or manipulation. Boundaries also protect emotional energy. Without them, a person may constantly react to criticism, guilt, or unfair demands. This repeated emotional strain can create stress, frustration, and exhaustion. Boundaries reduce this burden by filtering out behavior that does not deserve attention or response. Over time, people who maintain strong boundaries develop a reputation for self-respect and emotional stability. Toxic individuals tend to avoid targeting people who clearly defend their limits because manipulation requires cooperation from the other side, and strong boundaries remove that cooperation from the interaction. Completely observation is often more powerful than confrontation when dealing with toxic people because it allows a person to understand patterns before reacting emotionally. Toxic individuals rarely behave randomly. Their actions usually follow repeated behavioral patterns designed to create influence, confusion, or emotional pressure. When someone immediately confronts every small issue, they may only see isolated incidents rather than recognizing the larger pattern behind them. Observation allows time to connect those behaviors and reveal the underlying intention. Toxic personalities often rely on subtle tactics that become noticeable only when someone pays attention over time. For example, a manipulative person might frequently criticize others, but disguise those criticisms as jokes. In a single moment, it may seem harmless or accidental. However, when someone observes the pattern carefully, they may notice that these jokes always target the same person or appear whenever attention shifts away from the toxic individual. Recognizing that repetition makes it easier to understand that the behavior is intentional rather than coincidental. Observation also prevents emotional traps. When someone reacts immediately to toxic behavior, the manipulator gains control of the emotional pace of the interaction. They can escalate the situation, twist the narrative, or portray themselves as the victim. By observing first and responding later, a person avoids being pulled into these reactive cycles. This creates space for thoughtful responses instead of impulsive reactions. Another advantage of observation is the ability to identify specific triggers and strategies used by the toxic person. Some manipulators rely on guilt, while others rely on criticism, sarcasm, or social embarrassment. Careful observation reveals which tactics they prefer and when they tend to use them. Once these patterns become visible, their behavior becomes far less confusing. What once felt unpredictable begins to look repetitive and calculated. Observation also strengthens personal confidence. When someone understands the pattern of toxic behavior, they are less likely to doubt themselves or question their perceptions. Manipulative individuals often rely on confusion and self-doubt to maintain influence. They may deny their behavior, minimize its impact, or accuse others of misunderstanding the situation. When a person has observed the pattern repeatedly, these denials become less convincing. Over time, observation turns manipulation into something predictable. The toxic individual may believe they are controlling the interaction, but the person observing carefully begins to anticipate their next move. This awareness allows